Kansas Territory, 1886. The sun was a molten coin nailed high above the prairie, and the air shimmered with the same brutal heat that had bleached every fence post and turned the grass brittle as old paper. Elijah McCrae worked methodically. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat trickling down his temple as he tightened the last section of wire along the south fence. Every inch of this land, every weary mile of split rail and wire he'd built himself. Not because he thought he'd live to see it all tamed, he didn't believe in taming much of anything anymore, but because routine was the only thing that kept a man sane when he had nothing left to lose. He paused, squinting westward. The horizon wavered as if the earth itself were breathing out a hot sigh. Beyond the fence lay miles of grassland unbroken, but for the scattered cottonwoods and a lone wagon track. No one used that track. Not anymore. He took a swallow from his canteen, the water warm and metallic. He had been alone here for 3 years, and in that time, no traveler had appeared without a reason, good or ill. Mostly ill, and then he heard it. A creaking wheel half choked in the dust. A hushed voice. Then silence. Elijah froze. The hair rose on his forearms. He turned, slowly scanning the plain, expecting perhaps a trader lost off the main route. But what he saw stopped him cold. There, at the edge of his fence line, stood a wagon, so battered it looked ready to collapse. Its canvas cover hung in tatters, the wood splintered, the rear axle snapped clean through. 6 figures clustered around it, half hidden in the scant shade. He waited a long moment, hoping maybe the heat had conjured a mirage. But when the tallest among them straightened and stumbled forward, he knew it was real. Women, 6 of them. Even at a distance, he could see how young they were. The tallest couldn't have been more than 25. The smallest, a slip of a thing with hair pale as corn silk, looked no older than 16. Something in his chest twisted. He hadn't spoken a word to another soul in almost a year. Hadn't needed to. Solitude was a salve for a man who'd lost everything. But this was the first time in a long while he wondered if maybe the silence had turned him into something less than human. His boots felt heavy as he stepped to the fence. Dust billowed around the broken wagon. He could hear their breathing, shallow, ragged. "Hold there," he called, his voice rough with disuse. The tallest woman lifted her head. Dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, filthy and tangled, but her eyes were clear gray and steady, despite the exhaustion stamped into every line of her face. "We mean no harm," she called back. Her voice was hoarse, cracking on every other word. "Please, we need help." Her gaze never wavered. She didn't beg or lower her eyes, and Elijah had the strangest sense she was measuring him just as carefully as he measured her. He rested his hand on the fence post thumb, grazing the worn notch he'd carved there, his first winter proof he'd survived one more season. "Where's your driver?" he asked. "Dead," she said simply. She swallowed and gestured to the wagon. "He was killed 3 days back. They took our horses. We've been walking since." He felt something old and tired uncoil in his gut. "Who took them?" The woman's lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder as if afraid to speak the names aloud. The other women huddled closer, their bodies touching like a single wounded animal. The smallest one, the girl with pale hair, coughed a dry, rasping sound that made Elijah's throat ache in sympathy. "I'm Elijah McCrae," he said finally. He didn't know why he offered his name. Maybe because it was the one thing he still had to give. The woman lifted her chin a fraction. "Hattie Quinn." She gestured weakly. "This is Ada Ruth Maisie Lark and Grace." Her hand hovered over the girl who had coughed, the one whose 2 large eyes were fixed on the dry grass as if she could will herself invisible. "Grace is sick. Hattie continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "She hasn't eaten in 2 days." Elijah looked from one bruised face to the next. They were dressed in calico and homespun clothing, meant for women who'd never expected to be anywhere near this God-forsaken stretch of prairie. The hem of Hattie's dress was torn nearly to the knee. Ruth's cheek bore the ugly bloom of a fading bruise. Ada cradled her arm against her ribs as if she were afraid it would fall off if she let go. His stomach turned. "You were running from something," he said. Hattie nodded once. "From men who think we belong to them." Thunder rolled far away over the plains. Elijah turned his gaze west. On the horizon, he saw a thin line of dust rising in the still air. "They're coming?" he asked. Her breath shivered as she let it out. Yes. He knew then, with a clarity that scared the hell out of him, that this moment had been waiting for him since the day he buried Sarah. All the nights he'd lain awake blaming himself for every cruelty in the world, this was the test he'd always known would come. "Come inside," he said, and when Hattie started to protest, he lifted a hand. No time to argue. He vaulted the fence in a single motion and strode toward them. As he drew closer, the smell hit him, blood, sweat, fear. Grace's eyes flicked up to his, and for the briefest instant, he saw something there that shattered whatever defenses he still had. Hope. He reached her first. She weighed nothing at all when he lifted her into his arms. Behind them, the wind rose, carrying the promise of thunder. Hattie fell into step beside him, supporting Ruth with one hand. "They'll kill you for helping us," she said quietly. "Maybe," Elijah replied, "but I reckon I'm tired of living like I'm already dead." The 6 women followed him toward the ranch house, the battered wagon creaking behind them like a funeral procession. As they reached the steps, Elijah paused, feeling the ghost of Sarah's hand in his own. This was how it had started before a plea for help, a man's hesitation, a woman taken. Not this time. He carried Grace inside into the dim cool of the house that had been both his sanctuary and his penance. And outside, across the endless prairie, the dust cloud drew closer. The front door banged shut behind them, the sudden dimness of Elijah's cabin almost a relief after the blinding white glare outside. The heat lingered in the plank walls like a memory, but at least there was shade and stillness, and a chance, however slim, to catch their breath. Elijah laid Grace on his narrow bed, the quilt bunched beneath her thin shoulders. Her skin was so pale it seemed nearly translucent. Hattie hovered near fingers, twitching uselessly, her eyes bright with fear and exhaustion. "She needs water," she said hoarsely. Elijah nodded. "There's a crock in the corner." Ada and Ruth moved to fetch it, moving like women twice their years. He noticed Ada never let her right arm fall away from her ribs. Every time she shifted, her face pinched tight, and he suspected the bone was cracked, maybe worse. He turned back to Grace. Her breath came in shallow rasps. The girl's lips were cracked, her eyelids fluttering like she was dreaming of something she couldn't quite escape. "Grace." Elijah's voice was softer than he'd used in years. He touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers, surprised how hot she was. "Can you hear me?" She stirred her lashes, lifting just enough to show dull blue eyes. A faint sound escaped her throat, but no words. Hattie passed the cup to him with trembling hands. "She hasn't kept anything down since yesterday. We'll try a little at a time." He slipped an arm under Grace's shoulders and tilted her just enough to press the tin cup to her mouth. At first, the water dribbled past her lips, soaking his shirt sleeve. But finally, she swallowed. Once, twice. He felt an absurd flicker of hope. Hattie sagged against the wall, relief in her expression. Elijah eased Grace down again. "I've got a tonic," he said. "It might help the fever." Ruth's hollow voice spoke up from the shadows. "You live alone here." Her question had no accusation in it, only curiosity, but it struck him like a thrown stone. 3 years, he said without turning around, by choice. The women exchanged glances he couldn't decipher. He crossed to the high shelf where he kept the small brown bottles Sarah had once tended like precious relics. Sarah's handwriting still marked each label in tidy script. Feverfew, willow bark, laudanum. His fingers hovered over the laudanum. He knew how strong it was, knew how easy it could be to slip from relief into oblivion. But Grace didn't need oblivion. She needed to keep fighting. He took the bottle of willow bark and a tin mug. "I'll steep this," he said. "It'll help with the ache." Hattie watched him, her gray eyes unblinking. "Thank you." The gratitude in her voice sounded too big for so small a word. He looked away, unable to bear it. Outside, the wind shifted. In the hush, he heard the distant rumble of hooves. "They're close," Ruth whispered. He poured a measure of water into the kettle and set it on the iron stove. His hands felt too steady, like they belonged to someone braver. "You said they took your driver?" he said quietly. Hattie swallowed. 2 days ago, maybe 3. It's hard to tell anymore. Who were they? For the first time since she'd crossed his fence, she hesitated. "Slavers," she said at last. "They called themselves debt collectors, but they're no better than vultures." Her voice roughened. "They came to our settlement in Missouri, said we owed money we'd never borrowed. They showed papers with our names on them, signatures none of us had written. The sheriff." He looked the other way. Ruth's voice broke in. "They took us in the night." Elijah met Hattie's gaze. "You escaped." Hattie nodded. They stopped to rest near the Cimarron. Ada got one of the guards' knives. We ran. Ada didn't look up. She stared at the floor as if she could still see that night playing out across the boards. "We thought we'd die in that river," she murmured. "Maybe we should have." No, Elijah said. His voice was so certain it startled them all. "You did right." He turned back to the stove, taking comfort in the familiar ritual, adding dried willow bark, stirring, waiting. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "What about you?" Hattie lifted her chin. "I was a widow before I turned 20. My husband died in a mining accident. I thought nothing could be worse than that." She looked down at Grace, her hand brushing the girl's hair back from her feverish forehead. "I was wrong." Elijah understood more than he wished he did. He remembered the way Sarah's hair had smelled of sage and flower. He remembered the night Garrett had come pretending to offer help. He remembered choosing to believe the lie because he'd been too scared to stand alone. And he remembered burying Sarah when Garrett never brought her home. The past was a wound that never stopped bleeding. He carried the mug to Grace and coaxed a swallow between her cracked lips. Her eyes fluttered open and closed. For a moment, she seemed to focus on him. "Elijah," she rasped. He blinked, surprised. "You know my name?" Miss Hattie told us she whispered. Said, "You were the last good man she'd ever met." His throat closed up. "I'm no such thing," he managed. "Still better than most," she murmured before her eyes slid shut again. He looked over at Hattie, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. Outside, the hoofbeats drew closer. He set the cup down and crossed to the window. Through the narrow slit between the shutters he could see them now, dark shapes moving across the plain, dust rising behind. 6 riders spread in a crescent formation, sweeping the land as if they owned it. Hattie joined him, her hand brushing his arm. He felt her tremble. "There's no hiding from them," she whispered. He nodded. "I know." Her voice shook as she went on. "You don't have to do this." "I reckon I do," Elijah said softly. "Why?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Because how could he explain the way he'd woken every night for 3 years, hearing Sarah's voice, pleading, accusing, forgiving? How could he tell her that every sunrise he'd sworn He'd never stand aside again, no matter what it cost him. He turned back to the room. There's a trap door in the pantry. Crawl space beneath. If you hide there, you'll have a chance. Hattie squared her shoulders. And you, he picked up his rifle. I'll be here. She pressed her palm flat to his chest over the place his heart still beat stubborn as a mule. You're going to get yourself killed, she said, her voice breaking. Elijah looked down at her hand, so small against him. Then he looked into her eyes, gray as the winter sky. Maybe, he said, but I'm tired of hiding. The first of the riders came into view. At their head rode a man in a black vest and a battered hat. Even at this distance, Elijah recognized Wade Garrett, the man who'd sold Sarah, the man he'd run from once. Hattie followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her face. It's him, she breathed. Yeah, Elijah whispered. It's him. In that moment, the last of his fear burned away, leaving only something clean and fierce behind. He would not run, not this time. And when Garrett reached his door, Elijah McCrae would be waiting. The air thickened as the riders drew near. Dust curled in coppery spirals behind their horses, and the hoofbeats became a relentless drumbeat in Elijah's chest. He'd heard that sound once before on the day Garrett had come with his false promises, the day Sarah had been stolen from him. He tightened his grip on the rifle and felt the smooth-worn stock under his palm. His hands had built this cabin plank by plank. Now they might have to defend it plank by plank, too. Behind him, Hattie crouched beside Grace, whispering something he couldn't hear. Ada and Ruth huddled near the hearth, their hollow eyes fixed on the window. Even in their exhaustion, he could feel their awareness sharpen, as though every woman in that room sensed the same thing. He did. This was the edge of the world, and the next few minutes would decide whether they kept breathing. The lead horse drew to a stop in the yard. The others fanned out behind all mounted men dressed in dust-black coats and brimmed hats that shaded their eyes. But Elijah didn't need to see their faces to know their hearts were rotten. He could feel it in the way they held their reins, the predatory ease in their posture. Garrett was the last to dismount. He did it slowly, deliberately, as if he owned every inch of ground between them. The man looked almost unchanged, lean and tall with a hawk nose and that damnable badge glinting against his chest. But his eyes were older now, Elijah saw. Sharper, more dangerous. Afternoon. Garrett called his voice too smooth to be trusted. Seems you've made yourself a little homestead here, McCrae. Elijah stepped onto the porch, careful to keep the rifle level across his forearm. He didn't raise it yet. No sense making the first move if words could buy a few more heartbeats. Didn't reckon you'd remember me, he said evenly. Garrett's smile was thin and humorless. I remember every man who's owed me a debt. Elijah felt a flicker of old shame, but crushed it flat. I don't owe you a damn thing. The other man cocked his head. You sure about that? Because last time we parted company, I'd just lost a substantial investment. A fine woman worth more than you could ever repay. Hattie let out a strangled sound behind him. Elijah's jaw tightened. Don't you speak her name. Oh, I won't, Garrett said. He took a step closer, boots crunching over the dry grass. I'm here for other property today. His gaze shifted past Elijah to the cabin door. The look in his eyes was the same as the first time Elijah had seen him, the flat calculation of a man who believed nothing was sacred. You've got something that belongs to me, Garrett went on. 6 pieces of cargo I intend to reclaim. Elijah took one measured breath. He was keenly aware that the men flanking Garrett were shifting in their saddles, hands hovering close to holsters. If shooting started, he'd only get one clean shot. After that, no, he couldn't think about what came after. He tilted his head. You call women cargo now. Garrett's smile returned. Don't pretend to care about them. You didn't care about the last one." Elijah's vision went red at the edges. He felt his heart thud once hard enough to hurt, but he didn't lift the rifle. Not yet. "Those women came here for sanctuary," he said. "You're not taking them." Garrett shrugged. "You think you can stop me?" It wasn't bravado. It was genuine curiosity, the kind of question a man asked when he truly believed in his own invincibility. Elijah looked past him, sweeping his gaze over the horses, the men. 6 riders in all. 6 men who would burn his home to the ground and call it justice. Inside, he heard Ada's voice, hushed but firm. "We won't go back. If it comes to it, we'll die here." He swallowed. "You're outnumbered," Garrett said quietly. "You've got 1 rifle, maybe 2 pistols tucked away. You're not a hero, McCrae. You're a hermit, a coward who ran from a fight once already." Elijah's voice came out so low he barely recognized it. "Maybe that's true, but I reckon a man only gets so many chances to do the right thing." Garrett tilted his head, studying him with an almost clinical detachment. "And you think this is yours?" Elijah didn't answer. He shifted his weight, bracing for whatever came next. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind slipped across the yard, tugging at the brim of Garrett's hat. Then one of the riders flanking him cleared his throat. "Marshal," he said, "we burnin' the place or what?" Garrett's gaze never left Elijah. No. The other men looked surprised, but he raised one hand, silencing them. "I'm not in the mood to spend all day digging bodies out of the rubble," Garrett went on. "I'll give you one chance, McCrae. Send them out. You can walk away clean." Elijah stared at him. "You know I won't do that." Garrett sighed. Pity. Then his hand dipped toward his hip, and the world contracted to a single instant. Elijah's rifle snapped up before thought could catch up. The blast split the stillness in half. One of the riders toppled backward out of his saddle, his chest a red ruin. Shouts erupted. Smoke curled from the muzzle of Elijah's rifle as he threw himself sideways off the porch, just as 3 pistols roared in unison. Bullets shredded the doorway he'd stood in. Splinters exploded like hornets. Inside, the women screamed. Elijah hit the ground hard, his shoulder ablaze with pain. He rolled behind the water trough as another volley slammed into the porch. The trough's thick timbers shook under the impact but held. He heard Garrett's voice, calm over the chaos, flush him out. Boots thundered toward the cabin. Elijah worked the lever of the rifle, chambered another round. He risked a glance over the edge of the trough and saw 2 men sprinting for the side window, intending to break in. He fired. The nearer man jerked backward, clutching his throat. The other dropped to his knees, fumbling at his revolver. A shotgun blast boomed from inside. The window erupted in a spray of glass and blood. The second man fell sideways, lifeless. Hattie. He hoped to God she didn't step into the open. "Elijah," she screamed from inside. "They're circling." He pressed his back to the trough, sweat pouring down his spine. Garrett's voice again, closer now. "This ends today." Elijah shifted, bracing the rifle along the edge of the trough. He knew he couldn't win outright. 6 professional killers were more than any one man could hold off forever. But maybe, if he was lucky, he could buy enough time for the women to escape. Another rider appeared at the far end of the yard, firing blindly toward the cabin. Elijah sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger. The man pitched off his horse without a sound. 4 left. His mind counted them with a cold clarity that surprised him. Garrett's voice was nearer still. "You can't protect them all, McCrae." "I can damn well try," Elijah shouted back. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. He ducked down, fumbling for more cartridges. A pistol barked somewhere behind the water trough. The impact smashed into the boards inches from his shoulder. He loaded another round, feeling the tremor in his fingers. Then Hattie's voice came again, fierce and unafraid. "We're with you." He risked a look toward the cabin. In the shattered doorway, he saw her standing, blood on her cheek hair, while the shotgun braced against her hip. Behind her, Ada and Ruth had taken up rifles, scavenged from the dead slavers. And in that moment, as bullets tore into the cabin walls, Elijah understood he wasn't alone anymore. He would not fail this time. Not them. Not himself. And not Sarah. He set his jaw, drew in a steadying breath, and prepared to fight until the last cartridge was spent. The acrid tang of gunpowder choked the air. Smoke drifted in curling plumes across the yard, mingling with the golden shafts of morning light. Elijah pressed the warm barrel of his rifle against the rim of the trough and forced himself to steady his breathing. The yard was a battlefield, now dust churned by hooves, blood seeping into the dry grass. Somewhere to his left, a horse shrieked and tore free of its reins, vanishing across the prairie in a blur of dark mane and terror. Elijah. Hattie's voice carried over the racket, ragged but strong. He chanced a glance toward the porch. She was crouched behind a heap of split firewood, reloading the shotgun with trembling hands. A few feet behind her, Ruth braced herself in the doorway with a revolver in each fist. Inside the cabin, he glimpsed Ada dragging Grace behind the stove where the thick stone wall might shelter them if bullets punched through the boards. For a second, just a second, Elijah's heart seized at the sight of them all fighting beside him. Not hired men, not outlaws paid for their loyalty, but women who had almost nothing left except their own courage. And it was enough. The crash of splintering wood broke his focus. He twisted in time to see one of Garrett's men swing the butt of his rifle against the shutter of the side window. The boards buckled and fell inward. Elijah snapped his rifle to his shoulder and fired. The man crumpled in the window frame, blood streaking the sill. Another gun cracked Hattie's shotgun, deafening in the confined yard. One of the slavers, trying to flank the cabin, spun away with a scream, clutching his side. "Reload," Elijah called hoarsely. "I am," Hattie shouted back, jamming fresh shells into the breech with shaking fingers. A pistol shot clipped the edge of the trough. Wood splinters rained across his cheek. He ducked down, feeling heat flood his veins. 3 left, maybe 4. Garrett himself had disappeared behind the corral fence, no doubt planning his next move. Elijah wished bitterly for another man beside him, someone who could circle behind and pin them down. But there was only him, Hattie, and the women who refused to run. His hand found the leather pouch at his belt, fumbling out 3 more cartridges. He worked them into the rifle's chamber by touch, every sense straining for movement. Hoofbeats. Soft and measured this time, someone creeping up the far side of the cabin. "Elijah." Ada's voice was sharp with warning. "I hear," he called, rising halfway. The rider emerged at a trot, his revolver outstretched. He was young, no more than 20, but his eyes were the dead eyes of a man who'd already sold his soul. Elijah squeezed the trigger. The rider's body lurched sideways and slid from the saddle, thudding into the dust. The horse bolted. 2. He shifted his aim automatically, scanning for Garrett. For an instant, all was still. The yard held its breath. And then Garrett stood. He emerged from behind the corral gate, his own rifle gripped in both hands. His face was calm, almost pitying as he lifted it to his shoulder. "You think you can stop this?" he called, voice carrying over the wind. Elijah set his sights on Garrett's chest. "I can sure as hell try." They fired in the same instant. Elijah felt a hot punch in his side, a hammer blow that nearly folded him in half. But he didn't let go of the rifle. Through a haze of pain, he saw Garrett stumble back, clutching his shoulder. Hattie's scream pierced the haze. "Elijah." He dropped behind the trough, gasping. His free hand went to the wound, came away slick with blood. Not deep enough to kill him outright, but it would slow him. Boots scraped on gravel. Garrett's men were regrouping. He heard the one with the scarred cheek cursing under his breath. Elijah. Hattie's face appeared over the porch rail, white as paper. "You're hit." "I know." He forced the words through clenched teeth. "Can you move?" He looked at her and saw the raw terror in her eyes. The same look Sarah had worn when Garrett dragged her away. Never again. He pushed himself upright, bracing the rifle across the trough. The pain blotted out everything else. Garrett was reloading. He'd ducked behind the corral fence again, blood soaking his coat. Elijah Hattie pleaded, "You have to fall back." "No." His voice was low and final. "I'm not giving them the cabin." A silence stretched between them, just long enough for Elijah to wonder if this was the end. Then another voice rose behind him, Grace, hoarse and furious. "We won't leave you." He twisted, startled. Grace stood in the doorway, her thin frame braced on Ada's shoulder, a pistol in one hand. She looked impossibly fragile, yet her gaze never wavered. Elijah swallowed the ache in his throat. "You stay there," he ordered. "Don't you dare step into the open." She nodded once, but her hand didn't lower. A shot cracked. Wood splintered inches from Grace's head. Ada yanked her back with a curse. That did it. Elijah's fury blazed hot enough to scorch every last shred of fear from his veins. He shifted sideways, drawing a bead on the fence. Garrett had to show himself eventually. He counted the heartbeats in his ears. 1, 2, 3. A head rose above the fence, searching for a target. Elijah fired. The man jerked backward, dropping out of sight. One left, just Garrett. But he didn't see Garrett's shape rise again. A low voice rasped from the yard. "You're a fool, McCrae." Elijah scanned the fence line. "Says the bastard hiding behind boards." "You think you can save them," Garrett called. "You think you can save yourself. Watch me." Silence. Then, "You always were sentimental." Elijah's pulse thundered. "Come out where I can see you," he shouted. Nothing. He crouched lower, heart hammering. Sweat slid into his eyes, stinging. His fingers were numb on the rifle stock. And then he heard it. The scrape of boots behind him. His breath caught. Garrett had circled around the corral using the fences and smoke for cover. Elijah Hattie screamed. He spun too late. Garrett was already stepping onto the porch, gun raised. His face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes were alight with savage triumph. "You can't change what you are," he hissed. A shot exploded behind Elijah. Garrett jerked. His revolver fell from his hand. He turned to the doorway in disbelief, just in time to see Grace lower her smoking pistol. "Get away from him," she whispered. Garrett's mouth opened, but no words came. He crumpled to his knees, then fell forward onto the boards. Silence crashed over the yard, deafening. Elijah sagged against the trough vision, swimming. He pressed one hand to his bleeding side, the other clutching the rifle. It was over. Footsteps pounded across the porch. Hattie dropped beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "You stubborn fool," she sobbed. He managed a ragged smile. "Told you I wasn't giving them the cabin." She pressed her forehead to his. "You saved us." Grace stepped onto the porch, pale but standing. Her eyes met Elijah's. "So did you," he rasped. The women gathered around him, their hands steady on his shoulders, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Elijah closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he felt clean inside, whole and free. The dead were buried at first light. Hattie and Ada dug the shallow graves while Elijah sat propped against the porch post, one hand pressed to the bandages on his side. Grace crouched next to him, cleaning his rifle with quiet determination. The others moved back and forth with shovels, the earth pale and dry under the rising sun. Garrett's body lay apart from the rest. Even in death, he seemed to radiate that cold authority that had once bent decent men to his will. Elijah didn't waste time on prayers. Some men forfeited the right to be mourned. He watched as the last of Garrett's men were lowered into the hardpan, their hats covering their faces. Then Ruth stood over Garrett, her eyes flat as river stones. "We should leave him for the coyotes," she said, voice raw. Ada touched her shoulder. "He'd deserve it. But it's bad luck." Ruth stared down a moment longer. Then she spat in the dirt beside the corpse and walked away. The sun crested the distant hills, flooding the yard with a light, too bright, too clean. Elijah closed his eyes against the glare. For a moment he could almost believe it was just another dawn on the ranch, just another day of tending fences and living alone. Except nothing was the same. His ribs throbbed with every breath. His cabin lay battered and scorched, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. But more than that, something inside him had shifted in ways he couldn't yet name. He opened his eyes as Hattie came to stand before him. Her skirt was stained with dust and sweat, her hair falling loose around her face. "You're losing color," she said softly. "Let's get you inside." He tried to argue, but she raised an eyebrow in that way she had. The same expression she'd worn when she refused to abandon him to Garrett's mercy. "You're not going to win this one," she told him. So he let them help him to his feet. Each step sent a fresh wave of fire through his side, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Grace walked just behind her hand, hovering near his elbow in case he faltered. Inside, the cabin felt strange, less like a fortress, more like a place between things. He eased himself into the single chair near the hearth, and Hattie knelt beside him with a cup of cool water. "You ought to rest," she murmured. "I will," he said. But first he had to understand what came next. He glanced at the others. Ada and Ruth had begun collecting supplies, blankets, spare ammunition, the battered medical kit. Grace had settled onto the edge of the bed, her small hands folded in her lap. Elijah drew a long breath. "They won't let this stand," he said. Hattie met his gaze unflinching. "No, they'll send more. Garrett had a badge," he reminded her. "Even if he bought it, there'll be questions, investigations, men who think it's their duty to avenge him." Ruth's mouth twisted. "So what? We run again." "No," Hattie said firmly. "We don't. We've been running too long." Elijah felt a flicker of something, respect perhaps, or kinship. She'd carried her own burden of guilt and loss, just like him. And like him, she'd come to the end of hiding. He looked around the room at each of them. "You don't have to stay." Ada gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You think any of us can go back to the way things were after this?" Grace lifted her chin. "He tried to take everything. He didn't. That's what matters." Her voice, so small but so sure, quieted the room. Elijah leaned back against the chair, his gaze fixed on the sunbeam creeping across the floorboards. He thought of Sarah, how she'd died believing he would come for her, how he hadn't, and how these 6 women had refused to let him die cowering behind regret. "This ranch isn't much," he said after a while, "but it's land, fences, a well, a place worth defending." Ruth crossed her arms. "Then we stay." Hattie studied him, her eyes searching. "But, you know, it won't be enough. Garrett's friends will come eventually." "I know." Ada stepped forward. "We could ride north, find a magistrate willing to hear our side." Hattie shook her head. "And risk ending up in another man's pocket." Elijah lifted a hand, silencing them. "No more running," he repeated. He looked at Hattie, letting her see the decision he'd made. "This time we make our stand public." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We write to the territorial governor. Tell him everything: Garrett's trafficking, the extortion, the killings. I'll swear affidavits. So will you." Ada hesitated. even if it means hanging men in the Capitol." "Yes," Elijah said simply. Ruth swallowed. "You're signing our death warrants." "No," he said, "I'm signing theirs." The silence that followed was taut as a drawn wire. Then Grace pushed herself off the bed and walked to his side. Her thin fingers closed around his wrist. "I'll sign," she whispered. Hattie looked from the girl's solemn face to Elijah's battered one. Finally, she nodded. "Then I will too." Ada sighed, but a smile ghosted across her mouth. "Looks like we're all fools together." Ruth lifted her chin. "Better to die standing than live on our knees." Elijah felt the burn of tears he hadn't shed in years. "Thank you," he murmured. Hattie squeezed his shoulder. "We're not thanking you yet." For the rest of the day, the cabin became a place of quiet industry. Ada and Ruth set to work repairing the door. Grace boiled water and cleaned every weapon they had. Hattie wrote in her clear looping script, laying out each fact of Garrett's crimes. Elijah dictated, pausing only when pain made him lightheaded. He described Garrett's threats, the bribes he'd offered local lawmen, the names of ranchers who'd vanished without explanation. When the affidavit was finished, Hattie read it aloud. The words seemed to echo in the small room, carrying a finality that made Elijah's chest ache. Hattie folded the paper and met his eyes. "If this goes to the Capitol, there's no undoing it." "I know." She searched his face a moment longer. Then she set the document on the table and turned away, her shoulders trembling. Outside, the wind rose swirling dust across the porch. It moaned low under the eaves like something mourning or remembering. Elijah closed his eyes. He thought again of Sarah, how she'd died in darkness, never knowing she was loved to the last. He would not fail again, even if it cost him everything. That night, they sat together in the dim cabin. Hattie braided Grace's hair by lantern light. Ada stitched the torn hem of Ruth's dress. Elijah listened to the low murmur of their voices and felt something stir in his heart, a glimmer of belonging, a promise that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. And when he finally slept, it was not with guilt coiled in his gut, but with a grim, quiet hope. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, and this time he was ready. Dawn broke across the valley in a hush of cold lavender light. The wind carried the scent of ash and dry grass, stirring the memories of the fight that had ended Garrett's life. Elijah awoke with a throbbing in his ribs and the knowledge that today would test them all in ways bullets never could. He sat up slowly, fighting a wave of dizziness. Hattie was already up, her silhouette framed in the doorway. She had a rifle slung over one shoulder, her hair coiled in a neat braid. As she turned, the first sunlight struck her face, and Elijah thought she looked like a figure carved from the land itself, weathered, resolute, unbreakable. "Morning," she said softly. He managed a nod, gritting his teeth against the ache in his side. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Enough." She studied him with eyes that saw too much. Liar. He almost smiled, almost. Ada and Ruth emerged from the lean-to behind the cabin. Ada was brushing dust from her skirts while Ruth carried a burlap sack of provisions. Grace trailed behind, still pale, but steadier than she'd been in days. She wore an old coat of Elijah's, the sleeves rolled up past her thin wrists. "Everything ready?" Elijah asked. Ada nodded. 3 days food, spare ammunition, water, skins. It'll be tight if we're delayed. Hattie came to stand by the table where the folded affidavit lay beneath a smooth river stone. She picked up the paper and held it as if it were something alive. "This gets to the governor," she said. "Whatever happens to us, he has to see it." Elijah met her gaze. "He will." "Then we ride at noon," Ada said briskly. "The longer we wait, the more chance Garrett's friends will come looking." Ruth gave a short nod. "Best to vanish while they're still counting their dead." Grace sank onto a stool near the hearth, her hands trembling. "I've never been farther than Wichita," she murmured. Hattie crouched beside her. "Then you'll see something new, and you'll survive this. We all will." Elijah didn't say what he was thinking, that survival wasn't promised to any of them, that even if they made it north, the men in power might decide 6 traumatized women and a rancher with a past were easier to discard than to protect. But he also knew the alternative, letting the truth die with Garrett's corpse, leaving the next town or settlement vulnerable to the same horror. No, he wouldn't allow it. He rose carefully, ignoring the pain that tore through his side. "We ride," he said. Grace lifted her chin. "We ride." And so they prepared. By mid-morning, Elijah had saddled the 2 best horses and hitched the battered supply cart. He tied his old sorrel mare behind the wagon in case they needed a fresh mount. Every movement felt like dragging barbed wire through his ribs, but he refused help. At the edge of the porch, Hattie waited with the affidavit in her satchel. Ada checked the harness straps twice over. Ruth climbed into the wagon bed and arranged blankets into a makeshift nest for Grace. It was almost noon when Elijah stepped into the doorway one last time, scanning the cabin that had been both refuge and prison. The rifle propped by the hearth, the tin plates drying near the basin, the faded scrap of calico Sarah had once used as a curtain. He reached out, touching the rough wood of the doorframe. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room, "but I can't stay here." Then he turned his back on it all. Hattie climbed into the driver's seat, gathering the reins. Elijah mounted the sorrel with a grunt of pain. As he settled into the saddle, Grace looked up at him. "Will they chase us?" He met her eyes. "Probably." She swallowed hard. "And if they catch us?" Hattie's voice was calm, without bravado. "Then we make them wish they hadn't." With that, she clicked her tongue and the wagon lurched forward onto the rutted trail that led north. The first mile passed in silence. The land unfolded around them in sweeps of brittle grass and wind-gnarled mesquite. Overhead, hawks circled crying to one another across the emptiness. Elijah scanned the ridgelines for any sign of riders. Every glint of sun on rock made his hand tighten on the rifle. "They won't come in daylight," Ada called back from the wagon bed, "too exposed." Maybe he called, though he didn't believe it. Around mid-afternoon, they passed the burned-out shell of a soddy, blackened timbers sticking up like broken ribs. Hattie stared at it as they rolled by. Her face shuddered. "I knew the family lived there," she said after a while. "What happened?" Grace asked. "Garrett happened." No one spoke after that. As evening neared, the wagon creaked up a low rise. From the top, Elijah could see 50 miles of open prairie, the sky a riot of copper and rose. In that vastness, they looked so small, 7 souls bound together by accident and choice. But he didn't feel small. Not anymore. They made camp in a shallow draw where cottonwoods grew close enough to hide the fire. Ada and Ruth gathered deadfall for fuel. Hattie laid out the bedrolls. Elijah unsaddled the horses and rubbed them down. I feel his hands stiff with fatigue. When the flames finally took hold, they sat close together, as if by unspoken agreement. Ruth doled out jerky and stale biscuits. Grace wrapped her fingers around a tin cup of hot water and stared into the dark. "Did you ever think it had come to this?" she asked quietly. "No," Elijah admitted. "I thought I'd die alone." Hattie's eyes glimmered in the firelight. "Maybe you still will," she said gently, "but not tonight." He looked at her, and something in his chest eased. Not tonight. When the stars wheeled overhead and the fire sank to embers, Ada took first watch. Hattie and Ruth stretched out under the wagon. Grace lay curled in her blankets, her breathing finally slow and even. Elijah eased himself down beside the wheel, propping the rifle across his knees. The night was sharp with cold. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind hissed through the grass like an old woman's lullaby. He closed his eyes and let it all wash over him, the ache in his side, the weight of regret, the knowledge that they were risking everything for a chance at justice. He didn't know if it would be enough, but he knew this: he wasn't afraid anymore, and when morning came, he would ride on. The first light of dawn crawled across the grasslands in a hush of lavender and gold. As Elijah stirred from uneasy sleep, he knew before opening his eyes that something had changed. A stillness had settled over their little camp, not the comforting hush of an unbroken morning, but the kind that pressed on the ears warning of unseen eyes watching. He shifted carefully, wincing at the pull in his ribs, and glanced over at Ada, who sat on the wagon tongue sharpening her belt knife. Her face was grim, her eyes fixed on the trail that disappeared south. Hattie emerged from beneath the wagon with her rifle already in hand. Without a word, she joined Ada and followed her gaze. Elijah pushed himself upright and felt the day's first real fear seep into his belly. "What is it?" he rasped. Ada didn't look at him. "Smoke." He turned, squinting into the pale light. There, far down the horizon, a thin black column coiled into the sky. "Campfire, Grace?" asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "No," Hattie murmured. "Not this early. That's signaling." Ruth climbed into the wagon bed to get a better look. Her lips parted in a silent curse. "They're tracking us." Elijah felt his pulse thud in his throat. Garrett's men, he'd killed their leader, and no gang that professional simply disbanded after a single defeat. He'd known they would come eventually, but he hadn't expected them to come so soon. He turned to Hattie. "We break camp now." She nodded. No arguments, no time. Within minutes, they had scattered ashes over their fire pit and loaded the wagon. Ada hitched the horses, while Ruth and Grace passed out what little remained of their hardtack and jerky. "We'll ride hard till noon," Elijah said. "Then we'll see if we've shaken them." "They're better mounted than we are," Ada pointed out. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "We'll keep moving." Hattie slipped the folded affidavit into the breast pocket of her jacket. "Even if we don't make it, this has to." He met her eyes. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many words for the fierce, stubborn woman who had helped him believe again, but this wasn't the moment. He settled for the one truth he could speak aloud. "Stay close." They left the hollow draw and single-file wheels creaking in the silence. The smoke behind them thickened, darkening into a smudge of intent. By mid-morning, the horses were lathered and breathing hard. The wagon bounced over hidden rocks and ruts, sending jolts of pain up Elijah's spine every time he shifted in the saddle. Ruth, riding on the tailgate, kept glancing back. The third time she looked, her face went pale. "Riders," she shouted. "6, maybe 7. Elijah pulled his horse alongside the wagon. "How far?" "Less than 2 miles. Ada swore under her breath. Hattie leaned across the bench, her hand gripping his wrist. "We can't outrun them." He knew she was right. The horses were nearly spent, and the wagon was too heavy to risk over rough ground. But if they abandoned it, they'd leave behind the food, the water, and the only protection Grace and Ruth had against the elements. He scanned the land. To their left, the prairie rolled out in endless waves of grass. To the right, a low line of sandstone bluffs rose from the flat earth like the spine of some ancient beast. "The rocks," he said, "we make for the bluffs." Hattie followed his gaze. "They'll corner us. Better than dying out in the open." Without waiting for reply, he wheeled his horse and angled them toward the shelter of stone. They reached the bluffs an hour later, just as the first glint of the pursuers' rifles came into view behind them. Elijah dismounted and staggered to the wagon, untying the extra water skins and slinging them over his shoulder. "Ada helped me get Grace down." Ada climbed into the bed and lifted Grace as gently as she could. The girl tried to protest, but her voice was weak. I can walk." "You'll do no such thing," Ada snapped, though her tone was kinder than her words. Hattie checked her revolver, spun the cylinder, and looked to Elijah. "How many do you think?" "7, he said. "Maybe 8. "Too many," Ruth muttered. He ignored the sting of fear and forced his voice steady. "We take higher ground, make them fight uphill." Ada shook her head. "And then what?" He met her eyes, holding them until she looked away. "Then we make them regret following us." They scrambled up the first tier of stone, Ada and Ruth helping Grace, while Hattie and Elijah climbed ahead to scout. The wind tore at their clothes, whipping grit into their faces. Below them, the wagon stood abandoned, rocking slightly in the rising breeze. Elijah crouched behind a boulder, panting, and watched the riders fan out along the base of the bluffs. "They're spreading to encircle us," Hattie murmured. He nodded. "They'll try to drive us down." Her hand brushed his shoulder, a quick, fierce squeeze. "Then we hold." He wished he could believe it would be enough. The first shots cracked across the rocks just after noon. Splinters of stone sprayed Elijah's cheek. He ducked, lower heart hammering. Hattie returned fire, her rifle steady despite the tremor in her hand. Below, one of the riders pitched sideways, his horse bolting into the grass. Ada let out a whoop. "That's one," she said. The answering volley was furious. Bullets ricocheted off the stone, whining past their ears. Grace whimpered, covering her head with her arms. "Stay down," Ruth called, dragging her behind a slab of fallen sandstone. Elijah fired again, sighting carefully, and was rewarded by another cry of pain. But he knew the numbers were against them. Another hour passed in bursts of gunfire and silence. The sun climbed overhead, baking the rocks until the air shimmered. When the shooting paused again, Elijah risked a glance over the edge. 3 men remained visible, crouched behind their horses, rifles ready. 2 more had vanished, likely trying to flank them. "We can't stay here," he rasped. Hattie wiped sweat from her brow. "Then where?" "Deeper into the bluffs. We draw them into a bottleneck." Ada was already helping Grace to her feet. "Move then." They slipped sideways along a narrow ledge, stones crumbling underfoot. The world shrank to the scrape of boots and the ragged rhythm of breath. As they ducked behind a new outcropping, Elijah turned back just in time to see one of the flanking men crest their old position. The gunman raised his rifle, and a shot rang out. The man jerked and fell backward, tumbling out of sight. Elijah spun. Hattie stood braced behind him, her smoking pistol still raised. Their eyes met, and in that instant he felt something fierce and unbreakable pass between them. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. Her mouth curved into a grim smile. "Don't thank me yet." They reached the narrow cleft at the heart of the bluffs, as the last rays of sun caught the edge of the prairie. Elijah knelt beside Grace, who was shaking from fever and fear. "Stay here," he told her. "No matter what happens." She nodded, eyes huge. He turned to Hattie. "We make our stand here." She didn't argue. She simply moved to cover the left approach while he took the right. Ada and Ruth flanked them with the spare rifles. The shadows grew long. The wind hissed through the rocks, carrying the smell of sweat and powder. And when the final 3 riders came, they came all at once, charging the narrow gap with pistols blazing. The world erupted in fire and thunder. Elijah fired until the lever locked open on an empty chamber. Ada's rifle cracked beside him, then went silent. One man fell, then another. The last gunman staggered forward, revolver raised. Elijah met his eyes cold empty, and for a heartbeat he thought it was over. But before the man could pull the trigger, Ruth lunged from behind the boulder, swinging Ada's empty rifle like a club. The impact knocked the man sideways. Hattie stepped in and shot him through the chest. The echo rolled across the bluffs. Then there was only silence. Elijah lowered his rifle and looked around at the women, bloodied, bruised, unbowed. It was over. For now. He sank to his knees, every muscle trembling. Hattie came to stand beside him. She didn't say a word, but she reached for his hand, and he let her take it. In the hush of twilight, as the last of the gunman's dust settled, Elijah understood that whatever happened next, whatever verdict awaited them in New Haven, they had earned the right to stand before it together. And for the first time since Sarah died, he felt something like hope. The dawn after the battle in the bluffs broke clear and cold, as if the world itself needed to be washed clean. The prairie stretched away, hushed in the aftermath of violence. Elijah stood at the edge of the rocky cleft where they had made their stand, looking down at the bodies of the last pursuers sprawled in the dust below. 7 men lay dead, some by his hand, some by Hattie's and Ada's, and one felled by Ruth's desperate courage. He had known it would end this way if they chose to fight, but he had never expected it to feel so empty. Behind him, Hattie was dressing Ada's wounded arm, her hands steady despite exhaustion. Ada sat on a boulder, her jaw set against the pain. Grace dozed fitfully under a blanket, fevered but alive. Ruth was gathering their scattered supplies in grim silence. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the wind moving over stone and the distant call of a hawk riding the dawn. It should have been over. But as Elijah looked at the bodies, he knew it wasn't, because the man who'd organized this Marshall Lennox was still out there. And sooner or later, he would come to finish what he'd started. "Riders," Ruth called softly. Elijah turned so fast his ribs flared with pain. But Ruth wasn't pointing at the bodies below. She was looking north past the ridges where a thin line of horsemen was approaching 12 or 15, moving at a measured pace. Hattie stepped to his side, her hand resting briefly on his back. "Friends or enemies," she murmured. Elijah studied the riders. There was no sign of panic or pursuit in their formation. They rode 2 abreast, flagless, disciplined. "I don't know," he admitted. Ada had retrieved the spyglass from the wagon before they abandoned it. She handed it to him wordlessly. He focused on the approaching column, heart thumping. For a moment he saw only dust and movement. Then the lead rider emerged clear in the lens, a tall man in a dark blue coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. As he lifted his hand to signal a halt, the morning sun glinted off something pinned to his chest. A badge, but not like Lennox's tarnished star. This one was bright silver. U.S. Marshal Elijah breathed. Relief and dread tangled in his chest. Hattie took the glass. When she lowered it, her face was unreadable. "They found us." "Yes," he said quietly, "but which us are they here for?" They didn't run. There was nowhere left to run. Instead, they gathered what strength remained and climbed down from the bluffs to wait in the shadow of the sandstone. Elijah kept one hand on his rifle, but didn't raise it. He knew there would be no surviving another fight. When the riders finally reined in a stone's throw away, the man in the blue coat dismounted first. He moved with a measured calm that said he was accustomed to walking into tense standoffs. He was older than Elijah had expected, with iron-gray hair and a face lined by years and weather. But his eyes, steady pale blue, were alert as a hawk's. He lifted his hand in greeting. "Mornin'," he called, voice low but carrying. "I'm Marshal Abner Cole out of the Kansas City office. I'm looking for Elijah Carter." Elijah stepped forward. "You found him." Cole studied him a moment, then nodded. "Word reached us that a Marshal Lennox was using federal authority to run a slaving operation south of Dodge. You folks have anything to say about that?" Hattie's breath left her in a rush. Ada swore softly, her shoulders sagging. Ruth stepped up beside Elijah, her voice tight. "We have plenty to say." Cole looked over the group 6 women with dirt-streaked faces, torn dresses, and defiance in their eyes, and then back at Elijah. "Why don't you start with your side of it?" They told it all. In halting voices and fierce bursts, they described how Lennox had posed as a lawman while buying women like cattle from desperate families, how he'd trafficked them west under the pretense of contracts, how he'd hunted them like animals when they fled. Elijah spoke of the night they came to his ranch half dead with hunger and terror. He spoke of the fight in the bluffs, of how they'd killed the last of Lennox's men in self-defense. Cole listened without interrupting. The other deputies stayed mounted, their eyes scanning the horizon. When they finished, silence fell. Cole rubbed a thumb along the edge of his badge, thoughtful. "Marshal Lennox is dead," he asked finally. Elijah nodded. "He died in my yard." "Then you're going to have to come with us," Cole said evenly. "All of you." Hattie lifted her chin. "To stand trial." "No, ma'am." Cole's gaze softened just a fraction. "To make a record. To swear depositions. Because if what you say is true, and I believe it is, we'll have warrants to issue clear across the territories." Relief buckled Elijah's knees. He braced a hand on his thigh, breathing hard. Ruth closed her eyes. Ada looked skyward as if she might finally allow herself a prayer. Grace, still fevered, but lucid enough to understand, whispered, "We're free." Cole inclined his head gravely. "You're free." They buried the last of Lennox's men in shallow graves before they left. Elijah and Hattie worked side by side, not speaking, just moving with the quiet solidarity born of shared survival. By the time they saddled up, the sun was high. The prairie shimmered like hammered brass, and the wind smelled of dust and fresh-turned earth. Elijah swung up onto his horse and looked back once. The bluffs loomed against the sky, silent witnesses to all that had happened. He didn't know if he would ever see this place again, and strangely, he didn't care. Hattie pulled her mare up alongside him. "You ready?" she asked. He met her gaze and nodded. "I think I am." They rode north for 3 days. Cole's men set a steady pace, never hurried, but never stopping long enough for fear to catch up. At night, they made camp by the rivers. Ada tended Grace's fever, while Ruth mended what she could of their clothing. Hattie and Elijah often found themselves awake after the others slept. They would sit near the dying fire, knees touching the hush between them, as intimate as a confession. On the second night, Hattie looked over and spoke in a low voice. "You know, this doesn't end with us giving testimony. I know," he said, "he has friends, more men who will come looking." "Yes." Her hand found his under the blanket. "Then we'll be ready." He turned his palm to hers, interlacing their fingers. "Yes," he said again. When they reached Fort Merritt, the Army captain in command recognized Cole and waved them past the sentries without question. They were given bunks in the barracks, warm meals, and most precious of all, a night of sleep uninterrupted by fear. At dawn, Cole assembled them in the command office, where a young clerk sat ready with ink and paper. One by one, they made their statements. Ruth went first, her voice brittle but unflinching. She recited names, dates, the faces of buyers and handlers. Ada followed her jaw set as she described the night they escaped Lennox's caravan. Grace spoke in a whisper, but every word was clear. Hattie took the longest. She would pause, steady herself, and continue. When she finished, there were tears on the clerk's ledger. Last, Elijah stepped forward. He set down everything he'd seen, every choice he'd made to help them, every man he'd killed to protect them. When he signed his name, he felt a weight lift from his chest he hadn't known he still carried. Cole closed the ledger and looked around the room. "You did right," he said simply. Elijah met his eyes. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." 2 weeks later, in the town of New Haven, A federal judge read their statements and issued warrants for nearly 20 men, buyers, enforcers, and corrupt officials who had profited from Lennox's trade in human lives. Word spread like wildfire across the territories. The papers called it the reckoning on the plains. No one tried to claim the women as property again. Elijah never returned to his ranch. He sold the land site unseen, using the money to help the women start over. Ada and Ruth opened a small school in New Haven, where Grace eventually joined them as a teacher. Hattie did not leave his side. They took a patch of land north of town, a place of open prairie and tall grass, and built a house together. On a late summer evening, as the sun slid behind the horizon in a blaze of rose and gold, Elijah stood with Hattie on their porch. Her hand rested on his chest. "You still think you were meant to be alone?" she asked softly. He looked out across the land where the wind bent the grass in silver waves. "No," he said. Her mouth curved into a smile. "Good." And in the hush that followed, he leaned down and kissed her, the first kiss they'd allowed themselves since that terrible, beautiful morning when everything changed. They did not promise forever. They did not need to. Because sometimes the hardest battles were not fought with guns, but with the courage to begin again. And at last, Elijah Carter had found something worth beginning for. End of story.